Uh, Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you everyone so much for coming. We're going over the entire course for Econ 102. It's going to be exciting. I'm Evan. I'm here with UBC Simplified, trying to provide a bunch of review sessions and materials to help you for exams, which is tomorrow. So that is exciting. All right, so macroeconomics. Basically, we're looking at things in aggregate. So I don't know how many people took micro. Okay, perfect. So that's small. Now we're looking on a big picture. We're looking at countries, looking at the world. We're looking at how the overall economies are working. So a few variables that we're going to be using just for the exam. It's really important to just understand the definitions of each variable. So when you see a variable in a question, make sure you can define that, and then also understand how variables relate to each other and if there are any synonyms. So when we're looking at gross domestic product, or GDP, this is one of the key components. Basically, this is looking at a country's output. So it's essentially how much that company actually, or that country has actually produced in a given time frame. So there's the exact definition, which is the final market value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given time. So that includes things like haircuts, things like boxes, things like bags that they actually produce. And we'll get into kind of how you can calculate that. A little bit of a difference between GDP, which can also be called national income. Those two things are the same. If we're looking at kind of the actual value, so what it's worth, what's the dollar amount, that'll be kind of current. So that's valued in the current today's dollars. But then if we want to look at real GDP, so that's actually the measure of the actual output. So not just the monetary value, but like how many things are we producing, that's called constant, which is essentially real GDP. So constant dollar GDP is the same as real, current is the same as nominal. And just a little synonym, so gross national product is a little different than national income. So gross national product, GNP, it's basically all of the income that's received by Canadians as opposed to what's produced in Canada. So gross national product is what is produced or what is received, the income received by Canadians. So if they're living in the States or they're living somewhere else, but they're still Canadian and they're receiving that income, they're producing those things, that falls under gross national product, versus GDP is just what's produced within Canada. And then going along with that, we have potential output. So this is essentially what a country can produce if it's at normal full employment. So it's not extending its resources, doesn't have a zero unemployment rate, but it's at a normal unemployment. And if our GDP, so our Y, that's the variable we call it, is less than our potential, we're in a recessionary gap. And if our GDP or Y is greater than our potential, our Y star, we're going to be in an inflationary gap. And we'll get into that a little bit normal. But just a few things to keep in mind is that potential output is what a country can produce when it's at normal full employment. And we're going to call that U star. And we'll get to that a little later. A few more things. So unemployment, there's a few different definitions. So this is basically like measurement of how many people are unemployed. One thing to keep in mind is this is using the labor force. So that's going to be people who are 15 years of older and are actively searching for work. That's going to be included in the labor force. And we take how many people are unemployed out of the labor force, divide that by the labor force, and that's how we get our unemployment rate. So that kind of varies. And the few different types of unemployment. So we have frictional, which is basically like if I leave my job and I'm searching for another job, that would be frictional, so it's moving between jobs. And then we also have structural, which is basically like, let's say I'm a really good carpenter, but no one wants a carpenter right now, they want a coder. That would be kind of a structural thing where I am lacking skills, or maybe I'm in a different place. Maybe the fishing season in Alberta is really crazy right now and I'm a great fisher, but I'm not in Alberta. So it takes time for me to move to Alberta to create those jobs. That's where structural unemployment comes in. And then the last one is just cyclical. So we have kind of flows in the economy, right? So we'll go kind of be in a recession, we'll be recovering that, we'll be at a peak, and just the natural flows of the economy, when we expand, when we contract, that'll determine a little bit about the jobs and unemployment. So when we're at that U star, where we're at potential, the only unemployment that we will have is structural and frictional. We won't have any cyclical unemployment. So that's kind of unemployment. Now a little bit talking about kind of inflation. So purchasing power, this is just how much you can actually buy. Like, what is the value of your money? How much stuff can you buy, your real purchasing power? And then looking at productivity, can be measured in two different ways. So one is based on the amount of workers we have in the workforce. So it's basically comparing what our GDP was to the amount of workers in our workforce. But we can also do it versus hours worked. Because let's say for 1 year, everyone worked 100 hours a week, but then the next year everyone worked 50 hours a week, but you were still able to make the same amount of money, you would be much more productive. So using hours instead of workers is a much more accurate depiction of what our productivity is for a country. And the kind of productivity is a really good way to measure the living standards of a country. So based on their productivity, and then exchange rate. So if it's called exchange rate, it is measured in Canadian dollars. So it's like American, but how much Canadian dollars it would take to buy an American, the USD. But if it's external value, that is measured in the other currency. So that would be measured in USD. So external value, that'll be priced in the other currency. And an appreciation of the Canadian dollar is basically like the Canadian dollar is more powerful, we're able to buy more things, and that means the exchange rate goes down. So for an appreciation of the Canadian dollar, the exchange rate is going to go down, so then it's cheaper for us to buy one American dollar, to buy something from America. And then last thing we're going to talk about is just CPI. So this is basically, it takes a basket of like a bunch of different things. We have food, a bunch of different stuff that people would buy. It collects that into this one index, and then it tracks that index year over year. And this is used to measure inflation, which is basically like the change of prices year over year. And you can kind of calculate the changes in CPI based on the new year minus the base year divided by the base year to kind of get that percentage change, which would be normally your inflation rate on that, and a little bit distinction between full CPI and then core CPI, which includes really variable costs like energy and food, which can vary CPI a lot, and it's not really accurate depiction of what the inflation rate actually is. Okay, so we talked about GDP. How do you calculate it? 3 different ways. First way is through the value added approach. Basically, all you're doing is the price that you sell the final good at minus all the costs of the input. So it kind of goes through this supply chain, right? It'll start as some sort of item, and then as you add kind of value, so let's say it's flour, and then you give it to a baker, and they bake it into bread, and then you take that bread and you give it to a sandwich shop, and that sandwich shop turns into a sandwich. At each step, because of expertise and skills and experience, or even marketing, if they're really good at branding, they're able to add more value to it, and that kind of increases the price. And so you take the final value that you sell it to your final consumer, that they use it, and you minus all the costs of your input, and you add up that for all of the final goods within a country. That is how you calculate the GDP there. Most of the time, it'll basically just be the final price unless something's imported. So if we import like mangoes for $20, and then we sell a mango smoothie for $40, we'd have to minus the cost of the imports, like the $20. But if we grew the fruit here, it'd be a little bit different. So just watch out for when you're importing goods. So the next approach is expenditure. So we have 4 different additions for our expenditure approach. So the first one we have is consumption. So this is just all the services and goods that are bought by the households for their use. This is denoted as C, and it's kind of used up within the year. So that's kind of used up there. And then from the households, we have the firms, and this is where investment comes in. And there are 3 different components of investment. So we kind of have plant, property, and equipment. This is like if they purchase a new factory, if they purchased a computer because they're a coding company. These would be things that would be included in that. And it's important to know that you can buy computers as a household, right? So let's say I buy a computer, that would be under consumption. But if Microsoft bought a computer, that would be under investment because they're using that to produce other goods. They're using that as their servers. So same items can be in different boxes. The second thing for investment is just new residential construction. So this is if they're building a new house, a new apartment. This new residential construction will be added, the value of it will be added to GDP, not just if it's like renovations. That wouldn't necessarily be added to that. So it has to be newly constructed. And the last one is changes in inventories. So not just the total value of their inventories, but how much their inventory has changed from the last year. So if they've added to it, that would add to GDP. And if they've kind of taken stuff away, they haven't really produced as much more, then that would be subtracted. So changes in inventories could be negative. The third thing is government purchases, not government spending. So if government kind of gives you unemployment insurance, that's just a transfer of payment. Nothing's actually being produced. We're not making anything. So we don't include that in GDP. What we do include is things when they're like purchasing things. So if they're building a new bridge, if they're building a new highway, things like that where it's like actual tangible goods, those purchases, and those will be valued at cost as opposed to market value. So things in investment is going to be measured at market value, But for government, it's really hard to kind of measure, oh, what's the value of this police car that we're purchasing, or the police force that we're paying. So that will be valued at cost. And then the last one is when we produce things here and we sell them internationally, those will be exports. And when people produce things outside like mangoes and then import it here, those will be imports. And because we have to kind of take that into consideration, so we're subtracting imports from our total exports. So if we are able to make a lot of things here, sell them, and we don't import a lot of things, we don't buy a lot of things that weren't produced here, then that's really good. That'll add to our GDP. Are there any questions with that? Okay, moving on to our last approach, which is income. So there's two things. One are kind of net domestic incomes at factor cost. So basically, all that's saying is you're basically doing something to get something back. So we're starting off, we have wages and salaries. So you're putting in labor, you're getting money back. And these will be measured pre-tax. So before you take the taxes, like your personal income tax and other taxes, that'll be your value of labor, or your value of wages. And then the other thing is kind of interest. So this is what you earn when you put your money in a bank. You're getting interest, or if you're loaning out to someone, you'll get that interest back. It does not include government bond interest, though. That's one thing to keep in mind. And then the last thing is business profits. So this is dividends. So if you kind of have a stock, or you're getting paid a dividend from a business profit, and then also the business profit could just keep that money. So if you have a lemonade stand and you want to reinvest into that business, you'll make a bunch of money and you retain those earnings for future use and future years. And this is from the factor of capital. So both this and interest are from capital. You add up all of those, and then you also include your non-factor payments. So now, again, we did all these things pre-tax. We add in these indirect taxes. So this is things like GST, HST, the things that you purchase when you go to a store. You add in those taxes, and then you also add in depreciation, because gross domestic product adds in depreciation because it's not net. This is why we used to get gross. And depreciation is basically like if we're using computer, it gets a bunch of use. This is like how much it will cost to kind of replace that item. So we used our computer a whole bunch in a year. It kind of lost a year of its value. How much does that actually cost in order to replace it? And the reason that we have to add back depreciation is because if you look at an income statement, profits from businesses are taken after depreciation, but it doesn't actually, like, that just takes away from what's being produced. So kind of you can keep that in mind. And the last thing, we have to subtract subsidies, because this artificially inflates like the price of things that you're buying, because government gives a store money and then they can they have more kind of money or more profits because they're getting kind of free money from the government. So we add taxes, we add depreciation, and then we subtract subsidies, and that's how we get GDP. And those should all be equal to each other, ideally. Now, we talked about nominal and real GDP. So nominal GDP, the change in nominal GDP is made up of two things. One, the change in prices, right? Inflation. We'll get to that later. And then also just the change in output. We're really only concerned about the change in output. What is actually being made? Are we making more mangoes or whatever than we were making last year? And the way that we can do that is by taking the GDP deflator. So we take what is being produced, so the quantity, and we times that by the current prices. So that'll be what's actually right now. So that's our nominal GDP. And we divide that by the quantity at the base year prices. So whatever our base year is, that'll be the prices of what those items were priced at in the base year. And that's our real GDP. And we take that and we get the GDP deflator. And if we want to kind of work backwards from there, if we get our nominal GDP, we divide that by our deflator. That'll give us our real GDP. How much stuff, what is the value of the products that are being produced, like actual tangible value instead of like a super hyperinflated value. Any questions on that? All right, sweet. Moving through. All right, GDP is great. It's chill, except there are a few issues with it. So it's not 100% accurate. Could miscount. Maybe we produced a bunch more, but it might not be accurate. But because we do the same method of counting, the change in GDP is very accurate, and that's kind of what we're looking at. Also, illegal activities. If someone's smuggling drugs, or if they're having like money laundering, that's not included in GDP. People won't pay their taxes on that. So a country might actually be producing a lot more value, but because it's illegal, we're not actually seeing that. And also, you know, how do you measure free labor, right? How do you measure volunteers? That doesn't go into GDP. Also, quick shout out to everyone who's volunteered. Anyone here volunteered before? All right, yeah. Let's give a well done to you. That is awesome for you. And also quality of life. You know, you could be making a bunch of money. Maybe you're working 100 hours. Everyone in the country is making 100 hours. That sucks. It's not a good. And just leisure. Just chill, just vibe out. How do you measure the value of just like sipping a pina colada on the beach? To me, that's pretty valuable. But GDP doesn't measure that, which sucks. And the last thing is population size, right? So if you're a country with 10 people, they're not going to have that much GDP. If you're a country with 1 billion people, they're going to have a lot. So you can divide GDP by population size, and that gives you GDP per capita, and that's kind of a better comparison between countries with different populations of how much they're producing based on their population. Okay, so now we've talked about GDP. Now we're going to get into building up a model for kind of measuring essentially macroeconomics. So we have this chart, this scary looking chart. Basically, this line, the 45-degree line, is just this imaginary line. All it's saying is that when we're at a point on that line, our desired expenditure, which is our y-axis, equals our actual output. So it's just this imaginary thing that's saying, okay, when we are at that point in this line, the distance here will equal the distance there. And what those two distances are is one is like, how much stuff do people want to buy? And then on the bottom, our actual output is like, how much stuff is being produced? So our aggregate expenditure is our desired expenditure. It's like, oh, I really want to buy this Lego set. And then our actual GDP is like, is that Lego set being made? And if we're on that line, those two things are equal to each other. Okay, so now that we kind of understand a little bit about that, we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of economies. So we're going to start off. I am employed by this lovely ice cream parlor. We're in a spendthrift economy, which means that there's no savings, no trade, no government. So I get paid. I get my paycheck, and I'm just going straight to the store, and I'm spending my money on this beautiful Lego set, right? And then I go back to my store, I work, and then I spend money on the Lego set. That's the only transaction. So when we're in a spendthrift economy, what I'm getting paid is equal to what I'm purchasing. So we'll have Y is equal to aggregate expenditure because there's nothing else. There's nowhere else that it can go. I get all of my money, I get my income, and I spend it, and that is the output. So what I'm paying for is that Lego set, and there's no other like drains from the economy from that. So here you can kind of see just a little bit. It's just between houses on the firm. So I am working from the firm. I'm giving my labor to it, and I'm also going to then give money. So I'm giving my labor, which is in red, and then I'm giving money, which is in green, and then the firm in turn gives me wages. So it either pays me the money or it gives me the Lego set. So that kind of circular flow there, and we'll build up on top of that. So the red flow is for like physical stuff, right? So my time, my Lego set. The green stuff is for money. The cost of the Lego set, my wage. All right, but now we introduce this big bank. So rather than just buying a Lego set, now I can go to the bank and I give them a little bit of money. And they give me a little bit of money back in terms of interest. And I feel safe because my money is protected. And now that bank will take that money and it'll go out to maybe the Lego shop and say, hey, we'll loan you out this money and you can build this new factory. Invest in this new factory. So that's what the bank will do. So now we kind of have savings and investment. So I'm able to give it to the bank, and then the bank's giving that to companies, and then companies can use that to invest in factories, invest in new residential construction, and other types of investment. So now within the model, we're calling this frugal. We're adding in kind of the interactions. So we're giving the bank our money, and in terms of the bank is helping companies invest in actual tangible things like building these factories, investing in other residential and constructions. So we give it money, and then it kind of gives back these physical, tangible things. And this is a frugal economy. We're going to skip governed economy. We're going to now talk a little bit more about frugal economy. Okay, so now we're kind of talking about what makes up each portion of the aggregate expenditure. So why do I want to buy a Lego set? Why do I want to buy 2 Lego sets? What changes that? So for consumption, there's 2 types. One is autonomous, and this is like essentially necessary spending. You need to buy X amount, like the world needs to buy X amount for food, for water, for shelter. This is necessary spending. This will not change. It's a fixed point. But then there's also induced. So if I get paid more, I'm probably going to want to buy some Lego sets. If I get paid double that, odds are I'm probably going to buy a few more Lego sets. So the increase in my income, or the increase in Y, the national income, is going to increase my willingness to purchase more Lego sets. So the more I get paid, the more Y goes up, the more I will buy. And what affects just general consumption? There's 3 things. So one is wealth. So if I have more money kind of in my hand, if my net assets are higher, or sorry, if I have my net assets, but then the price level will go up, then I will have less wealth. So then I'll be less willing to purchase Lego sets because I need to save. And then also, expectation. So if I expect the economy to be in a recession over the next year, I'm probably not going to go buy that like new Millennial Falcon. And the last thing is interest rates. This mainly affects durable goods. So if I want to buy a car, I'm going to be trying to loan money out for that, and the interest rate is the price that I have to pay on that loan. So if the interest rate is super high, odds are I'm not going to pay for that car because it's going to be super expensive. So wealth, expectation, and interest rates all affect consumption. And we have our autonomous, necessary spending, and then our induced, which changes based on why. The bigger the why we have, the more Lego sets that I'm going to buy. So that's consumption. Now investment. Investment is just fully autonomous. So it's basically just a horizontal line that we add. It only affects the y-axis, and that's because it takes a while for investment to get into place. Sure, your GDP might be really high for 1 year, but it takes like 3 years to build a factory, or 1 year to build Rec North. It's been like 5 now. I don't even know. It's so long. But anyways, it takes a long time to put investment into place, and that's why GDP doesn't change it. You can't just go, oh yeah, I'm going to build a new factory just because I got paid more this spoon, and just like that it's built. It takes time. And a few things that affect investment is, again, interest rates, because buildings are super expensive. They're probably going to get loans. The more expensive the loans are, the more expensive the buildings are, which means the less buildings are being built, like factories. And also sales. So if a company is doing really well in 1 year, odds are they're going to expand their inventories the next year to keep up with those sales because they want to keep up with demand. And the last thing that affects it is business confidence. So if you start a business, you're like, I know that I'm going to sell. We're going to do so well. You're probably going to put more investment into that business to get a larger return. So this is your business confidence. If you're like, trust me, these Lego sets are going to sell, you're going to like double down, triple down, spend as much money as you can in order to get more profits out of that. So those are the things that can affect investment. All right, now we're skipping government economy, we're going into open. So now, pesky government is taking like 30%, 50% of my money in taxes. So now we're including taxes in here, but then they can also do purchases as well. So that's like things like healthcare, police, paramedics, other stuff that helps the economy. And then lastly, we can't grow mangoes in Canada, but now that we're open, I'm able to import mangoes from other places. So now we have our trade, our export, and our imports, and I'm really happy because we have mangoes. I really like mangoes, if you couldn't tell. So now we've added in the trade with the world, so our imports giving money to other people, and then our exports getting items sent in, and then government, we give them taxes, and they give us highways or healthcare. And this is the circular flow diagram that we kind of built up from there, and then we'll kind of go on how that affects aggregate expenditure. Okay, so what impacts taxes? What impacts government? So government's made up of taxes and then government purchases. So for taxes, if I get paid more, I'm going to pay more in taxes. If the national income is higher, more taxes are going to be paid, right? So there's this kind of aggregate level of tax, we'll call it T, just like the general amount of taxes being paid. If Y goes up, if national income goes up, that's also going to go up. So it's essentially just T times Y. That's the total level of taxes. So that's induced. Changes based on Y. But then purchases is basically just on who we elect. So if we elect a government who's like, I don't want to spend any money, that's not going to change whether or not we have high GDP or low GDP. So that does not change based on Y. Elections change for policy. Now, one thing to keep in mind is when we were talking, there's disposable income. So now that we're adding in taxes, my disposable income isn't just what I'm getting paid, but it's what I'm getting paid minus what I have to pay in tax. So now that's disposable income. So just watch between the difference between spendthrift and frugal, and now that we have open, my disposable income is a little bit different. So what impacts trade? Well, exports. If Canada's doing super well, but the rest of the world isn't, our exports aren't actually going to. Our exports are going to go down. So that doesn't depend on our domestic product, our Y. All it's dependent on foreign income. So if other countries are doing really well, they'll want to buy more stuff from us and import it to them, and also relative prices. So if we look super cheap, and we'll get to this later, to other countries, they're going to spend more money and export and buy more from Canada. So if Canada prices fall, right, so that's a kind of depreciation of Canada dollars, then we'll increase our net exports because it's like other countries are like, wow, it's so cheap to purchase things from Canada because their currency is super weak, so we buy it from Canada. But what impacts imports? Again, it's basically just like consumption. So like how much of the stuff do we buy do we want to import? You might like apples here, but maybe you like apples from California, right? So how much of that stuff, what percentage of the stuff you buy do you want to import? And that will be just like, it'll affect our our slope, which we'll see, and that'll just be kind of a number that'll affect our slope. So the more income we have, the more we'll want to import just because we have more money. And these are all for a given price level. So that's one thing to keep in mind. So this is called demand-determined output. Why is it called demand-determined output? Well, because when we go to the Lego factory and we say, hey, I want to buy one Lego, they're like, okay, sure, we have one factory. And now we say, okay, I want to buy 1,000. Well, they can just build another one, and build another one, and build another one, and build another one. And their output is based on our demand without having to raise prices. So they're able to do this without raising prices because they have unlimited capacity. They have excess capacity. And that's why this is at a given price, is because they have excess capacity. That's not the real world, but that's our model right now. Okay, so now we have our aggregate expenditure. We talked about what makes up consumption, what makes up investment, government, and net exports. Now, our function for aggregate expenditure now is a little bit more complicated. This might look a little bit complicated, but on the left here, we have all of our autonomous things. So all these are going to do is they're going to add up to our y-intercept. So we're adding them all up, and they're affecting our y-intercept. And then everything on the right is going to affect our slope. So we take our marginal propensity to consume, which is basically like out of what you get paid, how much do you want to spend back? How much do you want to spend? How much do you want to save? So if I want to spend 80% of what I make, my MPC is going to be 0.8. Now we have to times that by 1 minus our tax rate to get our disposable income, and then we minus how much our willingness to import is, and then we get our slope. We times our slope by our income, and that gives us a vertical line, which is our aggregate expenditure. So just a few kind of quick terms between the MPC. 1 minus the MPC will be our marginal propensity to save, how much we want to save, and then if we take a specific point on the AE line and divide it by what our Y is, so like what our consumption is, that'll give our average propensity to consume. So the difference is MPC is the slope versus average propensity to consume is just like the point on the curve divided by total Y, of total disposable Y. Okay, so now we have this thing called a multiplier effect. And the way that this works is that if we increase, let's say, investment, we spend a bunch of money, we increase investment by X amount, so our y-intercept goes up, how much will that actually impact real GDP? That's our multiplier. And the way that this works is it's just 1 over 1 minus z. And what is z? It's our slope of the line. So basically, we increase investment or we increase government spending by X amount, and then our multiplier times X will be the increase on real GDP. So if we have higher taxes, that means we're giving more money to the government, and then we have less money to spend. So the multiplier works is like, I'm going to a store and I spend money. Then that store has money and they spend a bit of money. Then that new store has money and they spend a little bit of money. So it kind of builds off of each other and keeps this snowball effect, and that's why we have this multiplier effect. So if we inject $100 into the economy, I'll spend $80. Someone else will spend a percentage of that $80, and it'll keep going and it'll keep snowballing until it kind of expands real GDP, and this is essentially why having a higher tax rate means I spend less, and also if you have a higher import rate, that means that we spend less within our economy. Okay, so we've talked about that. Now we're going into our short-run price level. So we've talked about aggregate demand. Now we kind of are going to talk about what happens when price level is different. So there's two things. We have aggregate demand and aggregate supply. And this is basically just a graph. We'll show it to you. It's just price and then what our demand will be, what our real GDP is. And the aggregate demand is negative slope. Why is it negative slope? Because as we increase price, so as we go up higher on the y-axis, we'll have lower wealth because we have assets. And if price goes up, the like $1,000 we have in savings has less purchasing power. And because it has less purchasing power, we'll spend less. Because it's expensive, we'll spend less. And then also, because when our price goes up, for foreign people in other countries, they'll be looking at our products and they'll be like, wow, this is so expensive. I don't want to buy from Canada anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else, which means that we'll have less exports. And because of these two things, our aggregate demand is going to be negative slope in relation to price. And one thing to keep in mind is that any shift in aggregate expenditure, so any of the one shifts that we talked about, what could change like consumption or investment, will also change aggregate demand in the same direction. And the amount that the aggregate demand shifts in the horizontal direction is equal to the vertical direction, the vertical shift like in consumption, times the multiplier effect. So we're measuring our multiplier based on the horizontal shift. We'll get to that with the graphs. And then aggregate supply is going to be upward sloped because of increasing unit costs. So remember how we talked about demand determined output? That's not how the real world works. We can't just make infinite factories. We might be able to produce a bunch more Lego sets, but our unit costs are going to rise. And I like using this example. For a applesauce making company, we have a set of apples. We can make some pretty good applesauce with a few apples. But if we need to scale up that production, odds are we're going to start using bad apples. And that means that we can use we'll have to cut off all the rotten spots, which means it'll be more expensive for us to make that applesauce. So our unit costs are going to rise. And that gets to a point. So we start off where we have excess capacity, but as we're producing more applesauce, we have to cut off more and more rotten apples because there's just not enough productive resources, and it becomes more expensive. So we get out of this what's called Keynesian range, which is basically where the supply curve is short. And we just make two assumptions for right now, is that factor prices, so like wages and stuff, are constant, and then technology is also constant. Now, we talked about what shifts aggregate demand. It's any shifts in aggregate expenditure. What shifts aggregate supply? Well, it's just any shifts in factor prices and any changes in technology. So if we create a new AI model that can expand our productivity, that would shift our aggregate supply in a positive direction. Now, what's the difference between a positive and negative direction? A positive shift, just in general, the equilibrium point increases Y. Negative shock decreases our equilibrium Y. That's the difference between positive and negative shocks. Okay, so here, how we were kind of talking about it, basically, we're building our aggregate demand graph from our aggregate expenditure. So all we're saying is, okay, at a different price, what would our equilibrium aggregate expenditure be? So at price 3, right, that's what our equilibrium would have to be, and so that point gets marked here. At this price, what would our equilibrium need to be? That gets put there, and we create a graph based on that. So at these different prices, any point along this line, this is our equilibrium GDP. So every point on an aggregate demand curve is going to be equilibrium because it's built off of, okay, so when we change prices, right, like demand's going to change, people are going to want different things, and so we graph that kind of change, and it's negative sloped for the reasons that we talked about before. So basically, yeah, it's just every point on this is an equilibrium point for aggregate expenditure. Short run, factor prices are constant. Now they can change. So now, what determines the equilibrium point? This is just our potential output, our Y star. And this is because this star, this magnet, attracts aggregate supply, this like magnetic metal like iron, back to the equilibrium, no matter what type of shock. So no matter what positive, negative supply-demand shock you have, it will always be aggregate supply moving back. And the reason this is because wages adjust depending on what type of gap you have to bring it back to potential output. And one thing to keep in mind is that recessionary gaps will take longer to close because wages are sticky. We'll get to this a bit later, but you know, if you're working your job and your boss says, hey, I'm going to give you a 10% demotion, you're not going to be super happy with that. So wages are sticky. It's hard for them to fall. It's hard for that curve to adjust with a recessionary gap. And this means that in the long run, aggregate demand doesn't impact our equilibrium point. It doesn't impact our Y. It only affects our price level, and we'll see how that works with some charts, with some graphs. Okay, so let's walk through kind of what's happening here. So our vertical line there, that is our potential output. And that is constant because we're assuming technology is constant. So we start here. Now we're having a positive aggregate demand shock. So our aggregate demand shifts to the right. It shifts to A22. So now that's where we were before, right, at Y1. But now because factor prices can change, we're in an inflationary gap, right? We're producing more than what we actually can. So because we're in an inflationary gap, we're spending a lot more money than workers, and unemployment's going to go down. Then workers are like, hey, I can ask for more money. I could get a raise. So then they ask their bosses for a raise, and their bosses have to do that because they can't hire more people because unemployment is low. So then the boss is like, sure, we'll give you this raise, but then it impacts their input costs. So then they're less willing to produce at certain price levels. So that's why our supply curve shifts less, because they're less willing to produce at certain prices because it's more expensive for them to produce an item. because they have to pay their wages, they have to pay their workers more. And that's how we close this output gap. We go back to Y star, but now we're at a higher price. Now we have a little bit of inflation there. So what does this look like if we have a different type of shock? So now we have a negative, right? So we're in a recessionary gap. So our 80, it moves. Now we're in a recessionary gap. And now this is where it gets a little sticky because basically firms are going to try to lower their wages because there's less demand, there's less being made, they're making less money, they can't pay people as much, so they're trying to lower these wages. And as these kind of wages are lowered and people start accepting lower paying jobs, then the aggregate supply will shift back because they're not paying their employees as much, so they're more willing to spend money, they're more willing to produce because they have cheaper wages. So it's all about the wage adjustment. So here wages will be decreasing, which will shift aggregate supply to the right, and then it will again center back at lower prices because it was from a recessionary gap, and this is kind of deflation when it's coming back to a lower price. And again, this takes time because of the stickiness of wages. And then the last one is, okay, well, if supply kind of shifts to the left, like input costs increase, well, eventually input costs are going to go down because, so let's say we have a shock, like oil prices spike up. So the shock of input will go down, but then we're producing less. So our oil shocks, we're producing less. Now we have less money to pay our workers. We might have to lay off some people. Unemployment is going to go up. And now because unemployment has gone up, people are more willing to accept lower paying jobs, which means that we'll be paying our employees less, which means it'll be cheaper for us to produce. And eventually that'll shift back to equilibrium point, to Y star. So because of those wages changes, because of increase in unemployment, it'll slowly shift back to Y star, but that'll take a long time. And the reverse is true with a positive supply shock. It's always the short run supply curve which is changing. Okay, but this isn't good. This takes a long time. So we have government intervention to try to speed things up. So this is what we know as fiscal policy. So this is changing government spending or changing the tax rates to try to speed up this recovery process, this adjustment process. So if you have a recession, what they can do is they can reduce taxes, both personal and corporate, and increase spending to try to stimulate the economy, to try to shorten a recession. But it might be too much. They might overshoot it, and it could also increase prices, increase inflation by having too much money within the economy. On the flip side, if we're in an inflationary gap, they'll increase taxes and decrease spending, and this could reduce the price level, but again, it might be too much. So they might overshoot it and then cause a recession. And then the last type is automatic. So this is basically, okay, so if our income is reduced, right, recessionary gap, then everyone's making less money, so the government will spend more money to help out the people who are now making less money. So if you were making like $10,000 and now you're making $5,000, the government will be more inclined to spend a bit more money on welfare or other things to help you out, and that additional spending automatically will increase G, which will increase aggregate expenditure, which can help shift to close the gap. And those are automatic stabilizers. And another thing to just keep in mind is, yeah, you might think, oh, we're in a recession, I need to save, so I'm going to save as much money as possible. But if everyone did that, everyone was saving, our consumption would decrease so much and we would just stay in that recession. And that's what happened during the Great Recession. Everyone was so scared, the government was spending, no one was spending any money. And so we had this really long recession because no one was spending any money. They were all too concerned about saving. This is the paradox of thrift. When you think, oh, I'm going to be smart, I'm going to save a bunch of money. But then if everyone did that as an aggregate, it would be very bad for the economy. And just a little quick touch on Reaganomics. This is basically, okay, we're trying to change potential output through fiscal policy. So we're going to reduce corporate and personal taxes. We're going to incentivize people to work more. We're going to incentivize corporations to take more risks, and hopefully shift Y to close that inflationary gap. And it's a little not necessarily, it doesn't really work that well. And this is because you could lower these taxes, but that doesn't necessarily mean people are going to work more. And also by changing your spending, potential output. Potential output can only change depending on what you spend on. So if you give people more money and they spend it on random things, it's not going to change potential output. What would change is if you build more bridges, more highways, you build things that can actually increase your ability to produce. That's what can change potential output. But the government can try to do that by reducing taxes for personal and corporations. Okay, so that's our aggregate expenditure kind of model. Now we're going to talk about what is money and banking. So right here, this is money, very clearly. It just makes life easy. So rather than having to say, oh, I have this beautiful water bottle, I'll give it to you, you give me that amazing mango or that amazing Lego set. You have to carry around a bunch of different things that you want, or you have to do everything for you. You have to cook, build your house, everything like that. It makes life easy. And it's this medium of exchange. So rather than having to exchange, trading, bartering, it's, okay, well, this is valued at something, and then I can pay just this money, this thing to get it, as opposed to having to carry around a bunch of different things to trade. So it has to be a medium of exchange. The second criteria for money is that it has to store value. So it can't just have value and then completely obliterates it. It has to have some form of store of value. And then the last criteria is you need to trust it. So the only reason that money works is because you trust it. Because you trust when you're buying that Lego set, or when you're selling that Lego set, the money that someone gives you, you're going to be able to spend it somewhere else. And it's going to have its same value. So you need to trust it. You're going to be able to spend it at somewhere place and store value. It's going to be worth kind of the same amount that when you sold your Lego set. Those kind of criterias need to be in place for money to work. Otherwise, if no one trusted money, then we wouldn't be able to use it. So if you're looking at, okay, if I had a $5 bill, the only reason it works is because other people will be able to spend that $5 bill because everyone will accept it. That's why you need to trust it. And if we look at the progression of money, right, so we had starting out with gold, and then they turned into coins, and then people started kind of deteriorating these gold coins by putting in fake metal in it. And then if you got two coins, if you had two coins, and one of them was real gold, and one of them was like half gold, half like nickel, which one would you want to keep? The gold one, exactly, right? So you keep that gold and you go spend those nickels. And what is that doing? That's driving out this good money, right? So this good money, this gold, you're going to keep that in your pocket. You're going to hold on to that. You're not going to sell that. And you're going to spend this cheap money. So that's where the expression bad money drives out good. So this like nickel gold infused is driving out this this gold because you're going to keep that. You don't want to spend that because it's worth more than what you could spend. And that kind of happened when people would try to cheat the system by creating their own coins or clipping. Okay, bonds. Lovely bond right there. I don't know what type of compound that is, but it's very lovely. This is the type of bonds we're talking about. No, but basically what a bond is it's a financial instrument which will pay you money most of the time at a set year. So like once a year, it'll pay you money, and then at the end of its term, at its maturity, it'll give you back its face value. So however much you pay, its face value, so let's say it's $1,000, it'll give you back along with its coupon rate. So this is like each year it'll pay you 5%. So if it's a $1,000 bond, you're getting $50 each year, and then at the end of like a 5-year term, you're getting your $1,000 back. And this is kind of like what can be used for loans. So the government can sell bonds, the bank can sell bonds, and the way that we value the bonds is through kind of the present value of the bond, which is basically like you're trying to discount the bond based on the current interest rate, because the current interest rate basically determines, oh, well, I could buy this bond, or I could borrow money and then buy this bond. And those two things have to kind of be equal to each other, because otherwise you could have like infinite money glitch. Like let's say the return on a bond was paying like a 10% interest rate, and then the interest rate was only 5%. You could borrow money at 5%, purchase a whole bunch of these 10% bonds, get unlimited money. So the reason that kind of the bond yields approach the interest rate is because of that kind of unlimited money glitch. They patched that, unfortunately. Sucks, that's version 3.0. But yeah, so, and that's basically the present value is what someone is willing to pay for it now. So it's taking into consideration what the interest rate is, because it's discounting from the interest rate, because that's basically like you're giving away you're giving away your money. You're giving them $1,000. They can do whatever they want for that. And it's discounted based on the interest rate, because you could either lend that out to someone else. And then one thing to keep in mind is just risk versus reward. So if I was to go to some random person and try to sell them a bond, they would have to charge a higher interest on me, because odds are I might not pay it back. But the government of Canada, super trustworthy, their yield and their interest rate on their bonds, the coupon yield, is going to be lower because it's a lower risk. So the higher risk, the higher the yield will be on the bond. and that also will scale with time, which we'll see. And then the biggest thing to keep in mind is that the prices of bonds, so how much a bond costs, its prices, its present value, is inversely related to interest rates. So if we had a bond that pays 5% interest rates, and its present value is, let's say, $1,100, but now interest rates skyrocket to 10%, and you're like, I want to invest. Am I going to buy a 5% bond with this or a 10% bond at the same price? You'd probably want to buy the 10% bond. So as interest rates increase, the yield of new bonds being released is going to increase, which means that the prices of current bonds are going to go down. So interest rates go up, the current bonds are like looking less valuable, and because they look less valuable, there'll be less demand for them, so the prices will drop. And because the prices drop, the total yield you get, which takes into consideration your purchase price, will go up. So interest rates go up, bonds look less attractive because they're paying less money than the new ones, so the prices go down, and because their prices go down, the bond yields will go up because now they're cheaper, but they're paying you the same coupon rate. So they're cheaper, but they're paying you the same coupon rate, so their total yield, what you'll get, your bang for your buck, once the bond completes, will go up. All right, so we're looking at the yield curve. All this is saying is risk versus reward. Here, we have like a one-day bond. I give you money, you give it to me back in 1 day, right? Lower risk, lower reward, lower yield. But if I'm saying, okay, I'm going to give you money, and you're going to hold on that for 50 years, and I really hope you give it back to me, I'm going to be expecting a higher interest, a higher yield that I'm getting for my money that I'm giving you. So that's why as maturity increases, the yield will also have to increase, reflecting that kind of a change in risk from the change in time. Okay, and then the last thing, we're going to talk about banks in this kind of section here. So these all hinge on confidence. That's the big key with banks, because we deposit money, and then they loan out our money. They don't actually keep our money on us. So they take these deposits, and then they repackage them, and they give them to loans to businesses, and that's how they make money. They'll give us 0.5%, but they'll loan out loans at 10%, at 5%, and then they'll make money loaning out these compilations of a bunch of different depositors' money. And it all hinges on confidence, because if we all were like, oh, I think banks lost all our money, and we all went to the bank, and we tried to withdraw all of our cash, it wouldn't have enough cash to support this. And this is what we call is like a bank run. So if everyone just stopped, all of a sudden stopped trusting banks, ran up to the banks and said, give me my money, they wouldn't be able to get all of that physical money, because most of it is just being created. They've just kind of created this fake money because they'll loan out like these deposits, and we'll talk about kind of what that is, but they just like create this extra money and loan it out, and then those investments, those companies put it back in banks, and it expands. So that's why we need to trust. We need to have confidence in it. And what has happened is the government introduced the CDIC, which gives us more confidence, saying that, okay, the government will guarantee a certain amount of our deposits to be safe. But because they guarantee that, banks can now take more riskier loans, loan out more money, keep less reserves, because they know that they're backed by the government. So banks can now take more risk because they kind of know, oh, we have this fail-safe. And then, again, interest rates, this is just kind of like the percentage you pay on a loan, so the interest you pay on a loan. So if you are getting a loan from someone, you're like, hey, give me $1,000, I'll pay you this amount, just like for kind of the generosity of giving me that money, because it's like the opportunity cost. Someone's giving you the money, and then you're not able to spend anything else with that money, so it's like payment for that. That's the interest rates. And then banks are like, hey, because you're not spending your money, you're holding it in our bank, we'll give you a super low interest rate because they like being fun like that. Okay, so the multiplier, this is what we were talking about. So I go up to a bank, and I give them $100. They're going to keep, I don't know, 20% of that. Then they're going to loan out the rest. And then where they loan out that rest of the money, they're going to put that in other banks, and that's going to get to other banks. And then they're going to loan out 80% of that, and that's going to keep multiplying. Just like how we were talking about the multiplier before, it's going to keep expanding, and this is where we get the money multiplier. So it affects two things. One is the reserve ratio, which is how much money the bank actually keeps on hand compared to its deposits. So it's its safety net. So if everyone ran to the bank, what's the percentage of deposits that it could cover on hand? Another thing that affects is the cash drain. So if you're just like a person, I want a lot of cash on hand, then you're going to be wanting to keep a bunch more cash kind of in your, under your bed, and that's going to take away from the money supply. So it'll decrease the money multiplier. So that'll decrease the money multiplier, and this will affect, the things that affect the reserve ratio, how much banks want to keep on hand, is the risk, so how much risk they're willing to take, and also expectations of interest rates. Because if interest rates are going to go up, they're going to keep those reserves, wait until interest rates go up, and then loan it out. And then just lastly, kind of two different things of deposits. There's demand, which is accessible at any time, and then term deposits, which have a minimum 30-day withdrawal. Okay, so just going through kind of monetary theory, we have demand for money, and this is negative slope because as interest rate falls, which you've seen, bond prices rise because they're inversely related, which means that as bond prices rise, there'll be less demand for bonds, which means there'll be more demand for money, and that's why it's negative slope. So bond prices increase, the demand for bond falls, which means you can either buy money or you can buy bonds. So now money looks cheaper, you want to buy money, and that's the supply for demand for money, and then supply for money is vertical because it's just set by the banks. It's basically what their reserve ratios are, how much they're willing to loan out. So it's different on the Bank of Canada and other banks as well. Okay, so monetary transmission theory, basically it's just saying, okay, how does changes in money supply or changes in interest rate affects aggregate expenditure? The way it works, there's kind of two ways. So money supply increases or the interest rate falls. Those kind of can happen simultaneously. It doesn't matter which one happens. But let's suppose that the money supply increases. As we saw, so the money supply will increase, then the cost of money will go down because there's excess supply. And because it's cheaper for money, then people will be more willing to buy money and they're wanting to sell their bonds. So if we look kind of how it looks in the chart, so we increase our money supply, so it's cheaper for money, so more people want to buy money, and then we'll be moving along the curve to a lower interest rate. And because we have a lower interest rate, our investment will increase. So here we increase our investment because now it's cheaper for you to build that building. So we change our money supply or we change the interest rate. Now it's cheaper for investments to invest more, so they'll increase their investment. And then because they increase their investment, and because when our interest rate goes down, people are like foreigners are going to want to sell our bonds, which means that they have to convert currency, which is going to depreciate the Canadian dollar. So there's two things. So one, when interest rate falls, investment will rise, and then there'll be foreign trade, so outflows. So interest rate goes down, Canadian bonds are going to want to be sold because they look less attractive, so which means that people will have to sell Canadian dollars, which is going to depreciate our currency, which means with a depreciated currency, exports from other countries will look more attractive, and imports will be more expensive because our dollar will be worth less. So both exports and imports will change because of a decrease in interest rates, and that all will mean that aggregate expenditure will increase, which means that aggregate demand is going to increase. So aggregate expenditure rises and aggregate demand shifts over to the right because of those two things. So we have money supply or interest rates affects investment, affects outflows, which affects aggregate demand, aggregate expenditure, which changes aggregate demand. And this is for a constant price. Are there any questions with that? So that's how it affects. That's how money supply or that's how the interest rate affects GDP. And the way that they do this is through 5 different things. So one is kind of overnight repos, so buyback. So just for one night, they're going to buy bonds from a bank, kind of give them a bunch more money supply. And that's so if they buy for one night, that'll drive the overnight rate down, and that's expansionary policy. The other thing is if they shift the deposits in the Bank of Canada to the deposits in other banks, that's also expansionary policy. It's giving them more deposits. And then the overnight rate, so this is kind of this operating band. The bank rate is at the top of the overnight rate. And this is basically, if they shift it, it'll shift the yield curve, it'll shift all the other interest rates, because this is like the cheapest you can get money. It's like for super safe banks, that's the bank rate. It's like what they're loaning out to the Bank of Canada. So if it's super low, banks can loan out more money from the Bank of Canada and then in turn loan it out to us. And then they can also do open market operations. So this is just if they buy securities from the bank, it gives them more cash, expansionary. And the last one is just announcement, because announcements have great power. So those are the 5 key components. And then these are essentially to target inflation, which we wanted to be between 2 and 3%. Because if we did it at 0, then people would be like, oh, why should I buy today? Why don't I buy tomorrow? It's going to be the same price. Then people would be spending less, and that is not good. And the reason that inflation is bad is because if people have assets or relying on fixed income, their real purchasing power goes down due to inflation. So that's kind of what's bad with inflation. And when they put in these policies, there's a little bit of lag. So it takes around 9 to 12 months for GDP to feel the effects of these monetary expansionary policies, and then inflation double that. So 9 to 12 months for GDP, and then double that for inflation to kind of really see the real effects. And the government might, again, overshoot. They might be too cautious. So they have to be cautious with this policy. And the reason it lags is because households take time to adjust to changes, and also the multiplier effect takes time, right? Because I have to go spend money, and then someone else has to spend money, and that's why there's the lags in monetary policy. And then so just a little bit more on inflation. We have, from the demand side, is cost push. From the supply side, like supply shocks. And we have employment. Unemployment is inversely related to inflation. So if you have really high inflation, we have really low unemployment, because high inflation means we're at an inflationary gap. We have a lot more money coming in. And also at low levels of unemployment, we'll have higher labor prices, which will kind of shift, which is causing, at low levels of unemployment, it'll be easier for you to demand more money, negotiate more money, which means prices are going to go up from a shift in the supply curve. And then basically, if we have a kind of demand push, or an inflationary gap, if we have monetary validation, which is like the government increases the money supply, they want to keep this party going because we're making so much money, we're making so much output, we're above potential, then this is kind of what happens when we get accelerated inflation, when they keep this party going. And then if we have kind of from supply side inflation, the government could either do nothing and have a long recession from the stickiness of wages, or they could validate and then increase inflation, which would increase prices by trying to adjust aggregate demand through monetary policy. Okay, so then unemployment, again, we were talking about kind of what is calculated it. Two different things. There's market clearing, which basically says there's no involuntary unemployment, which means wages adjust quickly. The only thing that causes unemployment is changes in technology or changes in willingness to work. So if you feel like working, that'll kind of change unemployment, versus the different theory of non-market clearing, which is what we were talking about before, the more realistic approach, which is wage stickiness. So this is causing, we'll have big labor shortages and long periods of unemployment. And one thing to keep in mind with unemployment is it doesn't keep in mind underworked people. So they could be employed but only working 5 hours a week. They're not actually making that much money. And also, it doesn't include discouraged workers. So it's only people searching for a job. So if people have given up searching, they're not included in the unemployment rate. So it's not super accurate. Okay, and then the last thing is wages, trade, just trade. So we have a difference between absolute advantage, which is like, can you make more stuff than the other person, versus a comparative advantage, or the other country, versus a comparative advantage, which is basically like, is your opportunity cost, so what you're giving up to make one thing better than the other person, and you want to trade with what you have the lowest, what you have the comparative advantage in, what you have the lowest opportunity cost. If you did micro, it's essentially very, very similar to that as well. And then the last thing is terms of trade. So pretty much there's this thing called the law of one price. So prices in different countries have to be equal to each other, no more than the price of transportation. So cheese in France can't be more than the price of cheese here, plus the cost of transporting it to here. And that's why we have the law of one price, kind of this holistic one world price. And then so when we create exports, this is because we have excess supply domestically at the world price. So this means that at the price that's been determined by all of the demand within the world, at that given world price, we would produce excess supply, and then therefore we'll export that. So at a given world price, if we have excess supply, we're going to want to export that, and the inverse is true for imports. And the terms of trade is basically just taking an index of all of your export prices divided by your index of all of your import prices, and the higher that number is, that means you can consume more because you're getting more money in from other people. So a rise in the terms of trade, a rise in this index of exports divided by index of imports means that you have more consumption possibilities. It's better for your economy. All right, if you could fill in this survey for your feedback for these sessions, that would be very, very helpful. Thank you all so much for coming to this econ review session. Good luck on your finals tomorrow. I hope it goes well.